Hello, and thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, we're going to be talking about Global Canopy's Deforestation Action Tracker. We're going to explain how it works. We're going to explore the methodology behind it, and we're going to show how it can help you address deforestation in your portfolios, because that is really the crucial point here. The Deforestation Action Tracker is designed as a tool for you. It's an aid to help guide good decision making. That is the point of it. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Darren Mckenzie. I'm one of the communication leads at Global Canopy. I'm going to be moderating. A quick bit of housekeeping for everybody before we start. Post your questions in the Q&A box. We are going to have time later in the webinar to answer any questions that you might have. The chat box is also open, so if you don't have a question but you would like to comment or kind of share your own thoughts, share your insights, please do use that. Don't be shy. And we are recording this webinar, so don't worry if you miss anything, because you won't miss anything. It's all recorded. Before we start, I also just explain in 30 very quick seconds what the Deforestation Action Tracker is. So it begins with a fact, I suppose. There is no way to reach net zero without an end to deforestation. Okay, it just cannot be done. That is the premise on which our work is based. For the last decade or so, Global Canopy has, with its Forest 500 program, been assessing the companies and the financial institutions that are most exposed to tropical deforestation. But financial institutions really are key. They are part of the solution, and they can drive change by engaging with the companies that they invest in, that they loan to. So the Deforestation Action Tracker looks at financial institutions with significant climate commitments. It looks at those who have pledged to get to net zero to see if their deforestation plans are compatible with that pledge. Today, let me introduce our panelists. Today, we're going to hear from Sarah Draper, who is Global Canopy's Corporate Performance Program Lead. She is here to outline the context. Nature has become much higher on the political agenda, so she'll explain why and why that means that financial institutions have to act. And we're also going to hear from Emma Thomson, who is our Deforestation Action Tracker Lead. She's going to, I suppose, demystify it for us. She's going to run through the methodology, show how we use it and how we can make it work. Before we start, we're going to have a quick poll, if we may, just to, I mean, it's completely anonymous, but we just want to find out exactly where you are in terms of addressing deforestation in your portfolios. So pick 1, 2, 3, or 4. Are you starting out? Are you at the very start of your journey to tackle deforestation? Are you learning? Are you currently kind of information gathering on deforestation and the associated risks? Are you developing? Are you creating that deforestation-free policy? Or are you a stage beyond? Are you implementing? Do you already have a policy? And are you putting that into practice? Are you engaging? So tick one of those boxes, and we will let you know sort of the results. The results are, I mean, it's a pretty even spread. Some of you are starting out, some of you are learning, some developing, some implementing. The Deforestation Action Tracker, the whole point behind it is it can help wherever you are on that journey, and we will explore that as we go through the webinar. So first, let's hear from Sarah, Corporate Performance's Program Lead at Global Canopy. Sarah, just give us the context, give us the why we're doing this, I suppose.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks everyone for joining today. It's great to be here. So yeah, as Darren said, we first wanted to cover just a bit of why deforestation, why we at Global Canopy focus on deforestation, and why you should focus on deforestation in particular as part of an ESG, biodiversity, nature, or climate strategy. So deforestation is a critical issue that is not going away. As Darren has already said, there is no solution to climate change without a solution to deforestation. Global forests are critical for absorbing carbon and therefore climate change mitigation. Current rates of deforestation are contributing 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As we've heard for some major companies and leaders, focusing on deforestation within their climate journey is an absolute no-brainer. Forests are also crucial for the livelihoods of 1.6 billion people that depend on them directly, and they hold the vast majority of terrestrial biodiversity. But they are still being cleared at an alarming rate, and the problem is only getting worse. In 2014, huge high-profile commitments were made to end deforestation by 2020, including the New York Declaration on Forests. But instead, deforestation rates actually increased by 44% between 2014 and 2020. And obviously, the deadline for those commitments has now passed. They aimed for 2020, and here we are halfway through 2023. Deforestation also poses real risks to the businesses in forest risk commodity supply chains, and therefore to the financial institutions that finance those businesses. In recent years, we've seen encouraging momentum and increased awareness of the need for financial institutions to use their leverage to eliminate deforestation from their portfolios as part of their climate action, but there is still much more to be done. Acting on deforestation presents an opportunity to companies and financial institutions. Deforestation is critical to tackle as part of a strategy looking at climate, people, or nature. It's also an area of nature which is pretty well developed in terms of data, metrics, and guidance. We've been looking at this for more than a decade, so it is a good place to start for broader ESG or nature commitments and policies, both in the terms of the impact that you can have and also the ability to implement already. Next slide, please. So why now? Why did we start the Deforestation Action Tracker last year? And why do we expect financial institutions to act on deforestation now? As said, there is growing recognition that action on deforestation has to be integrated into any credible net zero commitment. With 2020 past, companies and key guidance initiatives are now focused on eliminating deforestation by 2025. At COP27, the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero reiterated that financial institutions with net zero commitments need to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation and conversion from their portfolios by 2025. And in May, the EU passed legislation meaning that from 2025, commodities linked to deforestation will not be able to enter the EU market. And in 2 years, there will be a review to consider whether that should be expanded to also apply to financial institutions. Last year, the UN High-Level Climate Champions found that some of the world's most valuable food and farming companies could lose up to a quarter of their value by 2030 if they don't adapt to new policies and consumer behavior tied to the climate and nature crises. By addressing exposure to deforestation risks and impacts now, financial institutions can front load their action on achieving net zero, but also support biodiversity, support food security, and comply with upcoming regulation. Next slide, please. But also, until recently, there was no guidance aimed at the finance sector for how to address deforestation in your portfolios, and that is not true today. At COP26 in 2021, we published the Finance Sector Roadmap, which was developed with expert partners and in consultation with 60 financial institutions. The roadmap provides clear, practical, high-level guidance for all financial institutions to address deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights risks in their financing activities. It assumes absolutely no knowledge, so it takes the user through from, in theory, having never heard of deforestation before, through time-bound guidance to being able to actively eliminate it from their portfolio by 2025, or within 4 years of starting the roadmap. It defines best practice for financial institutions and builds off the guidance for companies of the Accountability Framework Initiative. Since the roadmap, we have developed more detailed actor-specific guidance pieces for pension funds, guidance for family offices and foundations, and also more detailed guidance on due diligence for banks and asset managers. Next slide, please. The roadmap and the other guidance is structured into 6 phases. They don't necessarily have to be completed in a linear order, but we do find that working from start to finish can help financial institutions to work out how all the steps they need to take and how to take them. The phases are broken down into steps and recommended actions. It was developed drawing on expert knowledge, but also data from NGOs, financial institutions, and it builds off existing work. And at each step and action, it points to additional guidance, data, and tools that financial institutions can use to take each action. In particular, I wanted to focus in a little bit on the risk assessment, monitoring, and engagement processes and disclosure. Disclosure of where you're at in your journey to understanding and acting on deforestation risks in your portfolio, on engaging your clients and holdings, and monitoring the progress they should be making towards deforestation-free supply chains is critically important. Disclosure provides important data to your stakeholders and helps them understand how you're meeting expectations on tackling deforestation. And really importantly, it sends a signal to drive industry-wide change and achieve deforestation-free portfolios across the sector. Monitoring and engagement in particular are going to be ongoing processes. So you do not and cannot really wait to complete those stages before disclosing. And without clear and transparent disclosure, stakeholders will not be aware of the work that you've started. And assessments such as ours will not be able to showcase the steps that you are taking. So you can see more in our guidance portal and guidance.globalcanopy.org. But with that, I will hand back to Darren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that overview. Just to repeat sort of that housekeeping, I suppose, if you do have any questions about anything that we're talking about today, please do use the Q&A box. If you've got any insights that you think you can add or you can help us with, just use the chat box. And this webinar is being recorded, so you will not miss anything. Don't worry at all. So Sarah's given us the context, the overview. It's now Emma's turn to, I suppose, get into the detail of the Deforestation Action Tracker. How does it work?
Thanks, Darren, and thank you to everyone for joining. I know that some of you were assessed last year as part of our baseline review that we conducted. So you might know some of this already, but it's just going over the Deforestation Action Tracker briefly first before we get into the 2023 methodology. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. As we've mentioned already, the Deforestation Action Tracker monitors the financial institutions that have made significant climate commitments, predominantly net zero commitments, including those through the Race to Zero and the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero. And the Action Tracker exists to track the action of these financial institutions on deforestation, on the conversion of natural ecosystems, and on the associated human rights abuses that are prevalent in forest risk supply chains. In 2022, we conducted a review of, at the time, the 557 financial institutions that were in the Race to Zero, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and the Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative. And from there, we created a baseline. So this was a baseline review that was constituted 12 indicators. And no numerical scores were given to any of the financial institutions that were included in that baseline review. From that baseline, we will be able to track the action and the progress towards eliminating commodity-driven deforestation, as well as conversion and associated human rights abuses by 2025, in line with the UN High-Level Expert Group call for 2025, as Sarah mentioned, and also some of the other initiatives that have that 2025 target date. This year, in 2023, we are conducting comprehensive assessments of what is now the 723 financial institutions that were included in the Race to Zero, in GFANZ, and the Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative. This does also include the 723, those who have left these 3 initiatives over the last 12 months. So those that were in those initiatives in our previous year of assessments, as well as at some point between the end of June last year and now, will also be assessed. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give a very brief summary of exactly how we have, which initiatives are made, which initiatives in these 2 coalitions are included. So as you can see on the screen, I won't read them all, but in Race to Zero, we have the Finance Deforestation Action Initiative, the Paris Line Investment Initiative, and then in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, we have the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and also, among others, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. Next slide, please. So now I wanted to take some time to walk you through what exactly the 723 institutions included in this year's Deforestation Action Tracker will be assessed on, now that we are conducting these more comprehensive assessments. So next slide, please. Financial assessment period, as you should have been notified of in an email last week, began on the 22nd of May and will end on the 31st of August of this year. Any information that is publicly available on your websites during this time will be considered in your 2023 assessment. So that could be anything from a formal policy document, a press release, a footnote in your annual report. If it indicates your position and your action on deforestation, conversion, or associated human rights abuses, we will review that as part of your assessment. It's important to note that as our assessments are based solely on publicly available information, no privately reported information will be accepted as part of the 2023 assessments, but it must be published on your website. All 723 institutions will be assessed on the strength and implementation of their commitments or policies on deforestation and associated human rights that are applied to your financial portfolios. This is against the best practice for the sector, which is aligned with the finance sector roadmap that Sarah walked us through, and as a result also aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative and their common methodology and operational guidance. Our assessments will be structured, as I will go through shortly, into 4 key sections, but all financial institutions will be assessed on this strength and implementation of commitments for palm oil, for soy, for cattle products, so beef and leather, and for timber products, so timber and pulp and paper. All of these assessments will be made publicly available in line with our 2023 launch, which is currently scheduled for around mid-November of this year. The next slide, please. Thank you. And to go through what's new this year, what's different, as there are quite a few things. The first is that this year our assessments will be done using the 2023 Forest 500 financial institution methodology. So as I mentioned, that methodology is aligned with the finance sector roadmap and the accountability framework, and is a methodology that has been annually reviewed since 2014 when it was first used, and is a well-established methodology for finance sector action on deforestation. What that really means in practice for those in the Deforestation Action Tracker is that this year, the methodology we're using is much more comprehensive. So as I mentioned, last year, the baseline review consisted of 12 indicators, and this year, as you will see shortly, there are many more, with a particular increased focus on implementation and transparent reporting on progress compared to our baseline review methodology. As I mentioned, still only publicly available information will be considered, so that hasn't changed. But one of the other big changes is that all assessed financial institutions will now be given a score out of 100. So whereas last year, no numerical scores were given, all institutions will now be given a score out of 100 based on the outcomes of this year's assessment. Next slide, please. Thank you. This year, financial institutions will be able to view their completed assessment before it is made publicly available. So this does still mean that no privately reported information will be accepted, but you will be able to view your completed Deforestation Action Tracker assessment through a platform through which, if you do have any feedback to provide, you will be able to do that. And you can share additional documents or information as long as it's on a publicly available link and was available at the time of our assessment period. The window in which you can view that completed assessment has already been set, and that is from the 19th of September to the 3rd of October of this year. So please do make sure either yourself or another colleague is available to view your completed assessment at that time if you would like to, as after that end date of the 3rd of October, no additional feedback will be considered. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I do want to take you through the 2023 methodology, how it's structured, the individual indicators that we're covering. I won't be walking through the methodology in a high level. I will be walking through it in a high level of detail. So I won't be going through the scoring guidance, the numerical scores associated with each indicator, as that will all be made publicly available on our website shortly. But I will just give you an overview of what the assessments will cover. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our methodology or our assessments will be structured into 4 key sections, as you can see on the screen. So the first is overall approach, which looks at the financial institution's high-level action on deforestation. So what are the high-level policies? Then we move on to policy strength, which looks at deforestation policies, policies that you require clients or holdings to have to implement that deforestation policy. We then have associated human rights abuses, which specifically looks at policies you have in place that require your clients or holdings to act on the key human rights abuses most associated with deforestation. And then finally, implementation and reporting, which looks at those policies and looks at the processes that are in place to implement those policies and any reporting that has been made to show the progress being made towards those commitments. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is how those 4 sections come together to create the total assessment and also the score out of 100. So there's a lot of detail on this slide, so do not feel you need to read it all. But the overall approach section is worth 6 points out of the total 100 available. Policy strength is worth 21 points for each commodity. Associated human rights abuses is worth 23 points for each commodity, and implementation and reporting is worth 50 points for each commodity. So those 3 final sections are all assessed once for palm oil, for soy, for cattle products, and for timber products. And then collectively, that adds up to your score out of 100. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, I'm now just going to quickly run through some of the indicators that make up these sections. These are not all of the indicators that will be included in the assessment, but just some that I thought it would be useful to highlight today. So in the overall approach section, which is that high-level approach on deforestation, our indicators look for things like, does the financial institution have an organization-wide commitment to eliminate deforestation or conversion from its financing activities? Does the institution recognize deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses as a business risk to the institution itself? And if so, what kind of risk is it identified as? And then the final one I wanted to talk through for this section is whether the financial institution is involved in any collaborative finance sector initiatives or advocacy for legislation focused on deforestation. So this is really looking at collaboration across the sector, ideally with the 2025 target date, but really looking for that collaboration and wider involvement beyond your own portfolios. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our policy strength section, which looks at things including, as you can see in indicator 2.1, whether the institution has a commodity-specific policy to eliminate deforestation or conversion of natural ecosystems from its financing activities. So for this indicator, the commodity must be named in order to score. So if your deforestation policy applies to palm oil and soy, then to score for this indicator, it does need to name palm oil and soy. Indicator 2.2 looks to see whether you require clients or holdings to provide proof that their operations and business practices comply with all applicable local, national, and international laws and regulations. 2.3 is looking to see whether you require clients or holdings to be able to trace their commodities back to a point where they can guarantee compliance with their commitments, or whether they monitor their own operations or suppliers for compliance to ensure that those commodities are being produced in line with deforestation and conversion-free standards. And then finally, indicator 2.4 for this section looks to see whether you require clients or holdings to conduct commodity-specific risk assessments related to forest risk. So requiring them to understand, are they exposed to deforestation risk and how? Next slide, please. For each of those indicators that I went through, we also assess the scope of those commitments that are in place. So again, I won't run through these all in detail, but we look to see whether that policy is applied to all operations and financial services that you provide. So for instance, is it across all of your operations, or is it only your asset management services? Whether the policy applies to all clients or holdings, regardless of their size. And then whether the financial institution has a target date for the full implementation of their deforestation policy specifically, or requires clients or holdings to have time-bound commitments to meet that standard. Next slide, please. The associated human rights abuse section focuses on the human rights abuses most associated with deforestation and whether the financial institution has policies in place to address those issues. The four that I've chosen to highlight here are whether the institution requires clients or holdings to ensure the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities prior to acquiring new interests in land. Whether the institution requires clients or holdings to ensure their business operations and supply chains meet key labour standards. So that's specifically including child labour, forced labour, freedom of association and discrimination that should be covered in that indicator. We then also assess whether the institution requires clients or holdings to respect the customary rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to land, resources and territory. And then finally, whether the institution requires clients or holdings to have a zero tolerance approach to violence and threats against forest, land and human rights defenders. Next slide, please. In the implementation and reporting section, which is the final section of our methodology and is I think is now the longest section of our methodology, I just wanted to run through 5 of the indicators with you. So the first is whether the institution requires clients or holdings in financial portfolios to have specified an organization-wide cutoff date for deforestation or conversion that would then be considered non-compliant with any commitments they have to be deforestation or conversion free. Ideally, that would be a cutoff date of 2020 or earlier, in line with the new EU due diligence legislation that Sarah mentioned earlier. Indicator 5.2 is whether the institution assesses their client or holdings exposure to deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuse risks in their portfolios at the point of onboarding, and also what processes are in place if that risk is identified. Indicator 5.5 is whether the institution has a clear public process to identify policy non-compliance in clients or holdings. 5.6 is whether following that non-compliance process, there's a process to engage with clients or holdings to manage non-compliance and ideally bring them back into compliance. And then finally, indicator 5.7 looks at whether the financial institution reports the number or proportion of clients or holdings to which the deforestation policy applies, the proportion which are compliant with their time-bound plans, if it's ones that the clients or holdings have set themselves, or in compliance with your policy. And then finally, the number of clients or holdings which have been engaged with on deforestation risk as a result of those non-compliance processes that were identified. Next slide, please. And then there are other indicators in our implementation reporting section, as you can see on the screen. One of those that we've added this year to both our Forest 500 and thus the Deforestation Action Tracker methodology is whether the financial institution annually reports on the progress of its clients, holdings, or portfolio towards compliance with each of those associated human rights policies that we went through earlier. And it also looks for things including, does the financial institution have a publicly available grievance mechanism through which grievances relating to either yourself as an institution or your clients or holdings can be reported. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I know a few questions have already come in the Q&A and in the chat, and I just wanted to go through a few frequently asked questions first. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I've mentioned already, but just to reiterate, we do assess financial institutions on the policies they have in place for 4 commodities specifically. So palm oil, soy, cattle products, including beef and leather, and timber products, including pulp and paper, collectively drive over 2/3 of tropical deforestation. And they are the 4 commodities that we assess institutions on as a result of them driving so much deforestation. Next slide, please. Our assessment methodology this year will be done using the 2023 Forest 500 financial institution methodology. Within the Forest 500, we have been assessing financial institutions annually since 2014 and have annually reviewed our methodology since then to ensure it continues to align with best practice. As we mentioned earlier, the methodology does align with the finance sector roadmap, and we will continue to annually review this methodology going forward as well. Next slide, please. One of the questions we often get is, why do we only consider publicly available information? So as a reminder, that is anything that is published on your websites, on your web domain, will be considered in the assessment. And the reason that we only use publicly available information is because there does need to be greater transparency from companies and financial institutions if we are to effectively eliminate deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses, especially by 2025. Further, incoming legislation is requiring greater transparency from companies, as we heard earlier, and the EU have already committed to review whether this should apply to financial institutions within 2 years. And so there is not only a greater need for transparency from financial institutions to eliminate deforestation, but there is also the growing likelihood that that will be legally required. And then finally, transparency really does enable collaboration and advances in shared understandings of challenges and progress, in addition to, of course, enabling accountability. But we have seen with the finance sector in particular, especially in the past few years, some really great progress with collaborative engagement that is created or fostered by that transparency. Next slide, please. The next question is, can organizations input into the assessments? And in short, no, in that the Deforestation Action Tracker assessments will continue to be completed independently as they were with the baseline review last year. But as I mentioned earlier, we have this year provided a window in which all financial institutions can view their completed assessment, which again is from the 19th of September to the 3rd of October. Any feedback that you have can be provided within that window if there is feedback to give, but any information shared with us must be publicly available within the assessment period. That is from the 22nd of May to the 31st of August of this year. And then again, the assessments will be published in mid-November 2023. Next slide, please. One of the questions which I think has also come in through the Q&A box is whether organizations are assessed in their native language or just in English. And wherever possible, financial institutions will be assessed in the key languages that they communicate in, and that is specifically defined as the national language of the country where the financial institution is headquartered. So this year, I think we have over 20 languages that we're assessing financial institutions in addition to English, but financial institutions will also be assessed in English. So if you are headquartered in another country where English is not the national language, you do not need to publish information in English. But equally, if all of your policies are in English already, you do not need to publish them in the national language. Next slide, please. So we covered this already, but just wanted to give a quick recap on how scoring works, as this is the first time that financial institutions in the Action Tracker will be given a score. So all institutions will be given a score out of 100. And then is made up for the overall approach, which is worth 6 points, which is assessed once for the whole financial institution. And then policy strength, associated human rights abuses, and implementation reporting are assessed once for each of those 4 commodities, added together, and then collectively that equals 100 and adds up to your total score. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we do have the Q&A available now, which we will go through in more detail. But if you do have any questions on your 2022 baseline review specifically, that's downloadable from our website, or you have questions on this 2023 methodology, you can also get in touch with the team at tracking@globalcanopy.org as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Emma. That was great. It's great to get into the detail. I'm now going to mercilessly throw questions at both Emma and Sarah. So please use the Q&A box, or if you've got kind of insights that you want to add, use the chat function as well. Emma, if I can start with you, this is the first question that came in. You did cover it a little, but the question says, how do you assess the strength of implementation if no private information is being assessed?
Yes, so our implementation and reporting section is worth 50% of financial institutions' score from this year. And to do that, although of course ideally we would be able to see what the outcome is of these policies and their implementation, but we do assess financial institutions on whether they have the processes in place to facilitate that implementation effectively. So if there is a deforestation policy in place, we would assess some of the other indicators that I didn't cover would be how frequently that policy is being reviewed and updated, whether there is a non-compliance process in place to identify that non-compliance with that policy, what happens next with engagement and with remediation plans. But some of our indicators do assess financial institutions on whether they report the number or proportion of a portfolio which is compliant with the policy, and thus ideally deforestation or conversion free, the number of clients or holdings that have been engaged with as a result of the policy, and the number or proportion of clients or holdings that are covered by that deforestation policy if it's in place. So we, for most cases, are assessing the processes that are in place to aid that implementation, but we do also have those reporting indicators as well.
There's a question from Christy, so thank you very much, who, again, you addressed it a little bit earlier, but Christy says, we take an approach across all these commodities rather than separating them by commodity. Do we have to detail out each commodity, even though we have the same approach for all? I mean, I suppose it's worth just explaining in a little bit more detail why we require you to name each of the commodities we assess.
Yes, absolutely. So if you do have an approach that covers all of your exposure to deforestation risk or all of those 4 commodities, it has to be named by commodity in order for us to see and know that that is a policy that you are specifically applying to palm oil, to soy, to cattle products, and to timber products. Publishing the information, and just to clarify, that doesn't mean you need 4 separate policy documents or 4 separate web pages on your website. If you have one policy, it is just stating that it covers each of those commodities in turn. And one of the reasons that that's so important is, well, there are many reasons why that's so important, but very clearly stating which commodities your policy applies to enables us to, of course, assess what your actions are in deforestation and the progress you're making toward them. It can increase pressure on other financial institutions to also strengthen their approach, in particular on deforestation. And it also helps to show the importance of why so many forest risk commodities do need action on deforestation. In particular, we see across companies and financial institutions that commodities, including palm oil and timber products, are the most likely to be covered by deforestation policy, but soy and cattle products, which with beef alone driving 1/3 of deforestation, they need greater action on those commodities from financial institutions and companies, and being very clear that your policy covers those commodities is really important for us, for you, and for other financial institutions to drive change.
Specifically on commodities, you've explained why we look at those 4 commodities in particular, but commodities like cocoa and coffee do also drive deforestation. Why do we not look at those?
So with cocoa and coffee and other commodities like rubber, and also some related to mining, these are all kind of drivers or commodities and products that do drive deforestation. In some cases, in some regions, in some countries, they are the largest drivers of deforestation. But as we assess financial institutions on their policies that apply to most tropical deforestation, we do only cover those 6 grouped into 4 commodities that drive 2/3 of tropical deforestation. It is something that we review annually and biannually to see, are we still covering the commodities that are driving the majority of tropical deforestation? And in our last review, it was still covering those 2/3, but it is something we do review and would be open to changing if needed.
That's great. Thank you, Emma. We've got a couple of questions on human rights, which I'll get to in just a second. But Sarah, I wondered if you could explain, I suppose, the thinking behind the baseline review. We have a question here that says, do we have a score from the baseline review? And yeah, answer that.
Sure. So no, you do not have a score from the baseline review. So the review done last year followed a much shorter methodology than the one that is being followed in 2023, and didn't have any scoring associated with it. So you can download the data and see how you were marked against each of the indicators that we did look at. You can also see how that compares to other financial institutions. But the reason we did a kind of higher level review and didn't have scoring was because it was the first year. It was in response to more commitments and more awareness from different initiatives on including deforestation in net zero strategies. And so we wanted to build into that momentum and start by collecting key data points so that we can see how progress is changing this year when we go into much more detail. So from this year onwards, we want to be able to give a score, which we have had feedback is helpful for financial institutions to understand where they're at and compare themselves to peers. But also to be able to provide that ranking and to continue to measure that progress. So that's why it was slightly different last year, but we'll continue in the greater detail from this year onwards.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Emma, 2 questions which I'm going to throw together because they cover similar issues. So one says, if we had a separate human rights policy, will you take this into account, or does it have to be included in our deforestation policy? And then kind of similar, but sort of perhaps a little bit more detail, human rights are a general part of our policy and not specific for deforestation only. Similar human rights issues also emerge, for instance, in mining. So does your human rights policy have to be linked to your deforestation policy, or do we look at a financial institution's human rights policy on its own?
We look at it on its own. If your human rights policy is solely related to deforestation or solely related to mining or to another sector or commodity, then that should be stated. But if it's a human rights policy that you apply to all financing, then we will absolutely review that and include that in your assessment. It does not need to be specifically linked to deforestation if it's a generic policy that you apply across all your financing.
We have a policy that looks at companies that are not compliant with principles of the UN Global Compact. They get excluded. As you know, Principle 1 and 2 of the UNGC is on human rights, 3 to 6 on labour. If this is something that we already have, it gets taken into account. I mean, you've sort of answered that, but I mean, it does.
Yes, essentially, if it's on your website and it details which human rights are covered, which issues are covered, then that would be considered as in your assessment of whether you have a labour rights policy or the other human rights policies that we look at. And there is also in the methodology document that we're publishing that will be sent around with the recording of this webinar, there is a lot more detailed guidance on each of these indicators that you can see. And then if you have questions on that, once you've seen that detailed, then please do follow up.
Great. Sarah, I wonder whether I can sort of throw a general question to you about advice. When we had our poll at the start of this webinar, we looked at whether organisations were just starting out, and I think 1/3 of the people on this webinar said, right, we are just starting out. We know from the baseline review that we conducted last year that actually the majority of financial institutions are at the start of this journey. So what's your advice on how to begin?
Yeah, so I think the first step, and this is also coming from the finance sector roadmap, is to really understand how you might be exposed to deforestation and how that might be impacting your financial institution, and working out what your leverage is over that deforestation. So starting to look at which companies make up your portfolios, understanding how you can start to map the risk, but also what tools are at your disposal to engage with those companies and start to drive change with them. Would definitely recommend looking at the guidance that is available out there, starting to see what the different steps are. You're looking at the full journey, even if you're starting with the step one, to understand how you can achieve deforestation-free portfolios. The finance sector roadmap is obviously one, which is in the chat, but it also points out to other guidance that can help you at each of those stages as well. So there are lots of resources out there. But I think, yeah, first understanding where you and your institution are at, and then starting to look at where your exposure is and how you can start to tackle that exposure are really the first steps.
The thing that we expect is we expect all financial institutions to have a deforestation policy. So is there guidance out there that says this is what a good deforestation policy looks like?
Absolutely, yep. So that is in phase 2 of the finance sector roadmap. And yeah, I mean, in brief, it is having a policy that sets out clear criteria for what companies in your portfolio need to be doing to tackle deforestation in their own supply chains. So what are your expectations of those companies? How can they meet them, and how can they demonstrate those to you? A strong policy also covers all of your financing. All relevant organizations in your portfolios should include both illegal and legal deforestation, and should apply to any companies throughout the supply chain. So from producing and processing companies, which are really close to deforestation activities, all the way down to retailers. And if you also finance banks or other financial institutions, those should also be covered by your policy.
Emma, can I ask if, let's pretend I am a financial institution. If I am both in the Forest 500 and the Deforestation Action Tracker, does that mean I'm assessed twice?
So there are just over 60 financial institutions that are included in the Deforestation Action Tracker that are also included in our annual Forest 500 assessments. As we're using the same methodology, each of those institutions will only be assessed once, and the data will be used for both of our 2 different projects. So you will only be assessed once. There will be one set of data for your financial institution, although it will then be available for both the Deforestation Action Tracker and the Forest 500.
There's also a question here about sort of the difference between asset managers and asset owners, and I suppose the guidance out there and the assessment, does it change?
So for the indicators in the Forest 500 methodology, which we're using, the Deforestation Action Tracker, we use the same indicator text for all types of financial institutions. So there are at least 6 different types of financial institutions that are included in our assessment this year. The indicator text does not change for each institution. We do understand that different financial institutions and different types of financial institutions do have slightly different relationships to deforestation risk through their financing, and as a result of the type of institution that they are. One of the changes we made in our methodology last year to better reflect that was the use of clients or holdings as language. So the policies that you have in place, you do not need to use the client or holdings language if that's not the language that you use. If you are an asset owner and you don't own any, you don't directly manage, or sorry, actively manage any of your own assets, and you have an asset manager that does that for you, then if those policies that you have in place are used or applied to your asset manager, they will still be considered in our assessment, provided that they have clear requirements on the clients or holdings that would be financed as a result of those policies. So regardless of how you are exposed to deforestation risk and your relationship to that, our assessments are really getting at what other policies you have in place that require those clients or holdings that are actively potentially linked to deforestation on the ground. What are they doing? So our methodology works for all cases.
And what about financial institutions which have significant subsidiaries? I mean, are they all assessed as separate entities, or are they all lumped together? How does it work?
Yes, so in the Deforestation Action Tracker, we are assessing financial institutions at the level which they made their net zero or significant climate commitment. So if your institution joined Race to Zero, but 4 of your subsidiaries have joined GFANZ, then they will all be assessed as separate entities. If your policy that you have in place at the parent level applies to all of your subsidiaries, including those in GFANZ, then the policies that you have in place as the parent can also be considered to assess your subsidiaries.
Got a question here about how a financial institution is able to identify if a company is involved in illegal deforestation.
I can talk about that briefly. So our Trace colleagues actually did an analysis of this as part of our consultations into new regulations that are coming through that we've talked about, and found that actually policies should apply to all types of deforestation, whether it's legal or illegal. And actually, it's much easier to identify deforestation activities and deforestation occurring in supply chains or in portfolios than it is to then work out which of the deforestation happening in that supply chain or portfolio is legal and which is illegal. So it actually is a simpler implementation and simpler process, as well as obviously covering more of the climate, nature and biodiversity and human impacts as well.
Sarah, I might just ask you a question a little bit about hope and what financial institutions can achieve in a very short space of time, in the sense of we're expecting significant action. We've set deadlines for 2025. How can you expect a financial institution who is at the start of this process to act quickly? Are there examples of financial institutions that have managed to act quickly and, I suppose, change their scores in the Forest 500, for example?
There is a very recent example from the latest Forest 500 results, which were published in February this year, where Schroders had gone from a very low score, which escapes me at the moment, but close to zero, up to the highest scoring financial institution. So they score around 50%, which obviously there's still a long way for them to go, and they've acknowledged that themselves, but is quite a significant jump in just 1 year. So that change was. So there can be quite a lot of change can happen in just 1 year. In our guidance, we do set out timeframes which we think are reasonable to actually achieve each of those steps, so to kind of guide you on how complex and how long each step should take. And yeah, it is absolutely possible to make quite a lot of change in quite a short amount of time, and it's urgent. So we definitely need you all on board in this journey.
Thank you very much for that. I think I'll just end by perhaps asking you to sort of reiterate those timeframes for the Deforestation Action Tracker. So what are we looking at in terms of timeframes for the year ahead? Yeah,
so Deforestation Action Tracker assessments have already started. They are ongoing at the moment. They will be finishing on the 31st of August, so that any documents to be included in those assessments must be available in that period, and assessments will finish on the 31st of August. The window in which you will be able to view your assessment before it is published is the 19th of September to the 3rd of October. You will be sent a link on how to view it. If there is a particular email address you want us to send that to, please let us know in advance. And if you want to view it, please do make a note of those dates and make sure that there is a team member who is around and available to view it. So again, that's the 19th of September to the 3rd of October. And then all of the results will be published in mid-November, and we will confirm the final date with you ahead of that as well.
Brilliant. I think we'll draw to a close there. Thank you very, very much for joining us in this webinar today. Thanks for your sort of engagement, for your excellent questions. Thank you to Emma and for Sarah for their presentations and their very clear answers. As I've said before, a recording of this webinar will be shared with you soon, including links to the methodology. And finally, we would be grateful if you could complete at the end just a very short survey at the end of this webinar. It should appear in your web browser. It will really help us make these things relevant and helpful to you going forward. So thank you very, very much for your time.